Hello, my name is Stuart Rutter, and this is my second video for Poker VIP. In the first video, we looked at just one hand and delved into all the issues of turning a made marginal hand into a bluff on the river. In this and future videos, I want to look at a few different hand histories to keep the pace faster and to make sure that we come across as many different issues as we can, because each hand that I've chosen will bring up its own specific issue. So I'll run this hand for the first time here at a 5-10 table. Our opponent limps into the pot. He's a 62% VPIP player, so I think without using any bad words, then we can imagine the kind of situation that this is. So I bet the flop with a normal sizing, and all I wanted to talk about, it's not the biggest decision in the world, but it brings up some very interesting comments, is the sizing on the turn. So we flop first and third pair, and a sizing of a two-thirds pot is completely standard. And then when this turn card comes, I just wanted to talk about the different issues of bet sizing, and the reason that my decision was to bet a fairly small sizing of 110 into 210, so just over 50% of the pot. But it's not specifically interesting things about this hand, but just the general issues that this brings up about how we would like to manipulate our opponent's range by choosing our bet size on the turn. So first of all, about this hand, obviously the flop is very strong, and when we are not raised, we can expect to be ahead on the flop. I would say 90% plus of the time, probably better than that. The turn could be better, but obviously it could definitely be worse. And although he probably does have all the flushes in his range, because it's a very passive player and he's not going to raise the flop as a semi-bluff, even if he has every flush that's available, he is going to have so much more than that, because he's going to get through the flop with so many hands, not raise the flop with a lot of hands, and going to have probably any pair available or any kind of straight draw available on the turn. So the first thing to say is that we are not going to worry too much about the flush, particularly if a turn bet is not raised, and that he can still have a very wide range here, and a wide part of the weaker range we are still in very, very good shape against. For example, we're in very good shape against King 8, and we're in very good shape against Queen 8, and slightly worse shape, but still very good shape against, say, just a jack without a club. So we are betting the turn with confidence, and the question revolves around how much of his range we would like to keep in, and do we need to bet big in order to protect our hand. Now, I think a lot of players, when this turn comes and they're kind of imagining their opponent's hand, will actually make the mistake not of thinking of ranges anymore, but I think on this board a lot of players almost kind of automatically pretend that they're betting against a hand like Queen Jack with a club. I feel that's a mistake, because obviously that puts us in not so great shape. We're going to be a favourite against almost everything, but against Queen Jack with a club, we are just, I think, a 62-38 favourite. Whereas against a big part of his range, we're going to be a very big favourite. I mean, it's even possible that we have him almost drawing dead if he is going to give his action and say King 8 of spades. He would be drawing just to a split pot. And I think the reason that a lot of players almost automatically assume Queen Jack with a club is that there's still kind of a big pressure on people to protect their hands properly. One of the first lessons that improving players are taught when they're beginners is always protect your hand, never give a free card, and don't give a cheap card. And although those are obviously solid lessons to be taught to beginners, then things are far more complicated than that. And I think we make a big mistake with our sizing here if our aim is to protect against his most dangerous hands, which of course would be Ace Queen with a club, Queen Jack with a club, or even King Jack with a club. We're probably a 70-30 favourite against that. Even though the turn is dangerous, especially against a weaker player, we can still definitely allow ourselves some hope that we can get action from much weaker hands. So the big question I wanted to ask in order to bring up the concept is, when we get a bet called by a hand with kind of varying amounts of equity, so anything from a hand that might make him a 50-50 shot here, I don't know if one's possible, but if it were a hand that would make him a 50-50 shot on a hand that's drawing dead at the other end of the spectrum, how much do we gain? So each time we're going to be gaining, as long as we're the favourite, we're going to be gaining a percentage of the bet. So if the bet here is 110 against different hands, we'll effectively gain in EV a percentage of that bet. So what is the percentage? Well, obviously, if we're have him drawing dead and the equities are 100 to 0, we are gaining 100% of that bet. If this somehow is an exact 50-50 and the equities are 50-50, we are gaining or losing nothing of that bet. And the answer to the question of how much do we gain in kind of EV money is that whatever the difference is between our equities, that's how much we gain. So if we are a 60 to 40 favourite, 60 minus 40 is 20, and we're gaining 20% of any bet that he calls. If we are a 70-30 favourite, the difference between them being 40 means we are now gaining 40% of any bet. And it's that difference that I think is important, that if we go from being a 60% favourite to a 70% favourite, i.e. our edge improves by just 10%, we are gaining double the amount of any bet. And that's why it becomes very important here to really try and keep in as much of his range, i.e. as much of the weaker part of his range as well as possible, because when we improve in equity just a bit, we are still gaining so much more of a bet. So basically here we have the decision between, do we want to really try and protect our hand, go to the extent where if he does have Queen Jack with a club, we almost can't give him odds to call, and I'm going to say that the answer to that is very definitely no, that would be a mistake. Or do we actually want to do what is the right thing and keep in as much of his range as possible at the sacrifice of giving the better part of his range good odds to call? And the answer is very much yes. We can still look at this term with a lot of positivity and expect to keep in really great hands for us, hands that we have in really bad shape if we bet small, and that it is completely right along with that to think, well, we're giving Queen Jack with a club good odds to call. With our bet sizing, we're even giving just Ace Deuce with a club completely the right odds to call. And it goes against the other kind of lesson that beginners are taught, which would be kind of fundamental theorem of poker. Make sure you bet enough that he doesn't have the odds to call, and therefore he would be making a mistake if he was. Now, if we actually think of how much we need to bet so that Queen Jack doesn't have the odds, Queen Jack the club doesn't have the odds to call, it's completely unrealistic anyway. When we make a pot size bet, what odds are we offering our opponent? Now, obviously that question I'm asking without any thoughts of implied odds or reverse implied odds on the next card, and it's impossible to have an exact science about this because of all those considerations. But on the face of it, what odds are we offering when we make a pot size bet? Well, that's 2 to 1. So our opponent would be right to call if he had 33% equity in the pot. So if he's got as much as 40% equity, or 38, I think he would have with Queen Jack with a club, we would need to pretty substantially overbet the pot to achieve the aim of not giving him the odds to call. So first of all, that's probably completely unrealistic to overbet the pot so that we don't give him the odds to call. And the most important thing to say about this hand is that we really don't want to. We are not gaining nearly as much with even kind of a 1.5 pot size bet that's called with where our opponent has a hand with 40% equity. We are only gaining 20% of that. By the way, there's a lot of numbers that are going to come out in this video, and I didn't want to be absolutely exact about them, because in poker it's wrong to pretend that you can be, because obviously we've already decided to kind of skirt over the issues of reverse implied odds and things like that. I think what's much more useful is to kind of come up with quick approximations and practice coming up with quick approximations, and that gives us still a very clear idea of how the concepts work. Because even if we fired a 1.5 pot size bet to try and protect our hand against the most dangerous part of his range and picked up 20% of that, we're still much better to fire this bet of just over half the pot and pick up anything up to 90 or even 100% of that bet when he calls with the very weakest parts of his range. So once we understand this concept that we gain so much more when the weaker parts of his range call us, what that says to us is that it would be a mistake to worry about properly protecting our hand. We're saying that it might be almost impossible anyway to protect our hand, and we just lose out on too much value. So if we took this to an extreme on the flop, if he had on the flop, say the ace, or say the jack of clubs on the flop for near 50-50 equity, it would be a real mistake to try and protect our hand then, because if the equities somehow were exactly 50-50, how much do we gain with the bet? Answer, absolutely nothing. So if, for example, there is a straight flush draw available and you have the top two pair, the equities in that example might be almost exactly 50-50, you do not need to worry at all about, oh, I have to protect my hand here, because what's far more important than the kind of vague concepts of protecting a hand or not giving odds to call is just the answer: how much of this bet am I gaining against different parts of his range, and against the very best parts of his range where he might be 50-50, we are neither gaining or losing anything at all. If he had such a good draw, if he had, say, a straight flush draw against our aces, it would be a real mistake to think about protecting our hand at all, because every amount of money that goes in, then he is taking more than 50% of it back, i.e. we're losing for every dollar that we bet. So this is why poker is far more complicated than just thinking about protecting our hands. That I'm sure you'd realise anyway is far too basic a view of, oh, I've got the best hand, he's chasing a draw, therefore I have to charge him. When we think about equities and percentage of bets that we win, then that completely goes out of the window. And the best way to prove that in one fell swoop is, well, what if we are ahead with our aces against his pesky 4-5 of diamonds on a flop which includes the 3 and deuce of diamonds? Now if we knew his hand, we'd actually be making a mistake to bet anything at all, because we're losing a very small percentage of any bet that we make because he is a very small favourite. So this is all part of the reason why I've bet small here. We're conceding completely that if we knew he had the queen jack with a club, then obviously our right move would be to move all in. And it would be very wrong to bet small here and not protect our hand. But we're always betting against ranges, obviously, and what we're doing here is trying to manipulate a range to keep in the weaker parts of it, because we just gain such a higher percentage of the bet. Of course, we can't just think of this in isolation, because there's a river card to come, and that brings even more reason to keep in the weaker parts of his range, because we then bet so much more profitably on the river as well, when he has, for example, a hand like King 8, which is practically drawing dead. So this is all very convenient because he's a 62% VPIP player against whom we don't have to worry about balancing our ranges at all. And it's very important to play this hand as if it were in a vacuum. And I think in a vacuum is basically a direct translation for not worrying about balance at all. However, if it were against a really strong player, it's still very important to kind of visualize this hand in a vacuum. First of all, because even if we can't allow ourselves to make different bet sizes, then we'd like the answer to the question, well, what would I like to bet if I didn't have to worry about balance? And secondly, against even the strongest player, it is absolutely fine to have different bet sizing ranges, as long as those are balanced. So on this board, we might have to want to have a very kind of wide middle of our range with which we make a fairly small bet here, And as long as that includes our strongest semi-bluffs and hands like this, it's absolutely fine to have a small bet size here, and we can have a different large bet sizing range with a much more polarized range, which might be here all the flushes and the sets, maybe, so the very, very top of our range polarized with either bluffs or semi-bluffs with very little equity. So just because we would want to bet big with, say, the nut flush here, it doesn't mean that with the middle of the range we can't have a different bet sizing. The only thing that's important if you are having different bet sizing ranges is to make sure that those are balanced, and it's basically equally likely that your opponent will catch a hand with poor equity, or he's going to on average have the same equity against the two different ranges, so he can't think that weaker bet on average is weaker, because it's not. It contains a middle part of our range, and the stronger bet will contain a much more polarized part of our range. So this is the reason that we're betting 110 here, and really try to get yourself out of the mindset, if you do have it, of seeing that turn and kind of almost visualizing a queen jack with a club in your opponent's hand. He can still have king 8, queen 8, even obviously ace 10 without a club is a hand that we would very much like to keep in. And ace 10 without a club, we are gaining so much more even with the small bet sizing than we would if we make a big bet sizing against queen jack with a club. So that wraps up that hand. The very important concept to kind of take with you being the answer to the question, how much do we gain when we kind of start to specify equities? And the answer is the percentage of a bet that we gain is whatever the difference is between the equities. So the way to remember it might be that it was 50-50. Obviously no one's gaining anything. If someone's drawing dead, the equities are 100-0, and therefore it's 100%. And the important thing being the difference between a 60-40 favourite and a 70-30 favourite. In the 70-30 case, we gain twice as much of a bet as we do in the 60-40 case. And that's why probably in every single example, we really need to choose to keep in the hands which we have in 70-30 shape. And we'll do so at the sacrifice of the 60-40 cases and offering our opponent slightly more generous odds to call, as long as it all keeps in with kind of wanting to be well balanced with all of our bet sizing. So that was that hand. I'll bring the next one up, which was actually in a £2, £4 game. So that's very much going to approximate to a $3-6 game, is there? And on iPoker, these games will run as well, and they'll, I think, be about the same standard as a $3-6 game. I don't really know why the games run in three different currencies, but what we're looking at here is basically a $3-6 game. We'll run the hand. So in the last video we talked a lot about the issue of turning a made marginal hand into a bluff. This is also about the issue of turning a hand into a bluff, but in a very different scenario, where the board very much does change like it didn't last week. And I feel our opponent kind of very surprisingly misses out on a very big chance to turn his hand into a bluff on the river. So that was our sneak preview, and we'll now go through the hand a bit more slowly. He raises to 10 on the button. I make what must be a pretty standard 3-bet, and his peel is absolutely standard as well. And obviously we both flop well, so I'm betting 39 into 60 there. The turn isn't perfect, but I can still bet small here. And the river basically couldn't be much worse, as it comes the 7 of spades, and so obviously this is a horrific situation for ace jack, because a lot of the time we're going to be behind, not necessarily against kind of a gut-shotted 8, because that would probably have to have spades with it a decent amount of the time, or against a flush, but just against 2 pairs really. And more to the point, when we check here, even if we suspect our opponent would turn a lot of things into a bluff, it still doesn't necessarily mean we can call at all. If we knew this guy is going to turn almost everything that he can into a bluff, so he's going to turn his king jack into a bluff, and he's going to turn his pocket 10s into a bluff, we still cannot necessarily call, as long as he would also value bet all of the 2 pairs, or the far more rare overpairs to the jack here. If he value bet all of his 2 pairs, and obviously everything better than that as well, it does not cancel out enough that he would turn a lot of hands into a bluff, because we still can't really call against our range. And so that's basically why I think it's imperative here for our opponent to turn his hand into a bluff, because even when we have great suspicion that he might do, it doesn't necessarily mean we can call. Now, if you have an opponent that would turn a lot into a bluff but doesn't value bet well, then his value bet range becomes a lot thinner, his turning his hand into a bluff range a lot wider, and now we can call. So I think one very important concept is to say that if you're going to be the player that turns a lot into a bluff on the river, which of course you should be, first of all, it's important to value bet really, really well. Because you need that to balance your range, and obviously also you should, because you're going to be getting called a lot wider as the guy that turns a lot into a bluff on the river, and therefore even on obviously kind of the scariest boards, then this is a clear opportunity to value bet 6-5, or you might even value bet ace jack here, if you maybe had an opponent who could have king jack. So that's the first important concept, that if you're going to be turning hands into a bluff, make sure that you're value betting very well for those 2 different reasons. The most important thing to say here is, from our opponent's point of view, he really, really should be turning his hand into a bluff here. And even if we're going to be suspicious of that, he's still pretty much safe. Now, I would expect that an opponent with a weaker hand, if he had called down with pocket 10s here, I think he's going to be far more enthusiastic with pocket 10s to turn his hand into a bluff, because obviously king jack has better showdown value. And so don't be the person with king jack that kind of is aware that it might be a good idea to bet all in here, which is slightly less than the pot, and turn your hand into a bluff, but then think, well, king jack could well be ahead here, maybe my opponent is trapping me, but maybe he's going to check all of his flushes to me because I value bet well and because I'm going to turn a lot into a bluff, and then find yourself checking behind, basically in the hope that your king jack might be good. I think it's a real mistake to kind of click the check button and just hope. This is far too good of an opportunity to turn your hand into a bluff on the river. And so make sure that you're not less likely to do it when you have the stronger parts of your range. The difference between king jack and pocket 10s isn't that much at all. I'm not going to have queen jack and jack 10 that much of the time, because I've 3-bet from the small blind. Obviously I can have it, but I'm going to have it far less than I would have ace jack here. And it's ace jack that we really need to kind of be aiming at, and that's the reason why I think it's very important for our opponent to turn his hand into a bluff here. So I was surprised that he did, and almost kind of felt kind of that I've been given a bit of a gift here that he didn't, because I feel that I just cannot call this river, even if I am very suspicious that he might do. So I think this has obviously become a very kind of developing part of the game, and it's what makes them so tough here, that I pretty much have to check ace jack on the river, and if my opponent piles kind of the near pot size bet, I pretty much have to fold it as well. So make sure you don't pass up on opportunities like our opponent did here, to turn your hand into a bluff. And the mentality that I think is the wrong one is the one that every poker player has to some extent, which is to be kind of just really desperate to get to showdown, kind of, oh, maybe my hand's good anyway, and if I check here, then I get that news. I get to see whether my hand's good. I said in the previous video that the river is by far the most important street for your decisions, basically because you'll be making the biggest decisions. So even if it doesn't seem as clear an opportunity as this to turn your hand into a bluff, always make sure you kind of let the river time down, really think about things, and you'll find that you don't miss opportunities like that. When you're my opponent here, just think how disgusting that card is likely to be for me, and that you basically give me or your opponent in this hand a present by not turning even a hand as strong as king jack into a bluff.